A single dad just wanted one quiet school night. So he hired a kind stranger to pretend to be his wife just for an hour. It worked, until his little boy looked up and asked, "Is she my new mommy?" Now the lie has legs. Teachers smile. Neighbors whisper. The boy starts to believe. But who is this woman, really, and why did she say yes? As the pretend family grows closer, a hidden past knocks on the door, and the truth threatens to explode in front of the whole town. A prize-winning school essay, a jealous ex, a secret that could break a child's heart. Faith, kindness, and one impossible choice collide. When a fake family starts to feel real, what happens first, the truth that saves them, or the lie that destroys them? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun peeked through the kitchen window of the Cooper home, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Daniel Cooper stood at the stove, spatula in hand, watching eggs sizzle in the pan. His movements were quick and precise, practiced from years of morning routines. "Ethan! 5 minutes until breakfast," he called up the stairs. The sound of rushing footsteps and drawers being pulled open echoed from above. Daniel glanced at his watch. 7:15 a.m. They were running behind schedule as usual. The toast popped up with a mechanical ding, and he quickly moved it to 2 plates, followed by the slightly overcooked eggs. "Coming, Dad!" Ethan's voice carried down the stairs, followed by the thump, thump, thump of his feet as he descended. 8-year-old Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway, his backpack hanging off one shoulder, brown hair still messy from sleep. His blue t-shirt was on backwards, making Daniel smile despite his rush. "Buddy, your shirt," Daniel pointed out, setting their plates on the small kitchen table. Ethan looked down, twisted his lips in concentration, and quickly pulled his arms in to spin the shirt around without taking it off completely. "Fixed it!" They sat down together, the morning silence broken only by the scrape of forks against plates and the tick-tock of the old clock on the wall. Daniel noticed Ethan pushing his eggs around more than eating them, his usual appetite nowhere to be seen. "Everything okay, bud?" Daniel asked, reaching across to touch his son's hand. "You've barely touched your breakfast." Ethan looked up, his eyes carrying a weight that made Daniel's heart ache. "Mrs. Thompson gave us papers yesterday about family celebration night next week." Daniel nodded, remembering the bright yellow flyer he'd found in Ethan's backpack the night before. "That's right. The one where you show your projects about your family, right?" "Yeah." Ethan's fork clinked against his plate. "You'll come, won't you, Dad?" "Of course I'll be there," Daniel assured him, trying to catch his son's downcast eyes. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." A small smile crossed Ethan's face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Tommy and Jessica were talking about it at recess yesterday. They said their moms are helping them make special posters and stuff." His voice got quieter. "Tommy asked who was going to help me with mine." Daniel felt the familiar twist in his gut, the same one he got every time Ethan faced moments like these. He set his fork down, his appetite vanishing. "I can help you with your poster, buddy. We could work on it this weekend." "It's not the same," Ethan mumbled, his lower lip trembling slightly. "All the other kids will have their moms there. They'll be wearing nice dresses and bringing cookies and stuff." The clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, searching for the right words. "I know it's hard, Ethan. I wish." He stopped, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I wish things were different." "Me too," Ethan whispered, finally looking up at his father with eyes that seemed too old for his young face. Daniel glanced at his watch again and stood up, forcing himself to keep moving. "We need to get going, bud. Don't want to be late for school." The drive to school was quieter than usual. Usually, Ethan would chat about his friends or what he hoped to do at recess, but today, he just stared out the window, his small hand clutching the strap of his backpack. After dropping Ethan off, Daniel drove to Cooper's Auto Repair, his small shop on the edge of town. Throughout the day, between oil changes and brake repairs, his mind kept drifting back to Ethan's face at breakfast. The sun was setting when Daniel finally locked up the shop and headed home. He found Mrs. Martinez, their elderly neighbor who watched Ethan after school, knitting in their living room. "He's been very quiet today," she said softly as she gathered her things. "Barely touched his afternoon snack. He's in his room drawing." Daniel thanked her and climbed the stairs to Ethan's room. The door was partially open, and he could see his son sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by colored pencils and paper. "Hey buddy, what are you working on?" Ethan didn't look up from his drawing. "It's for family celebration night. We're supposed to draw our families." Daniel moved closer and felt his heart sink as he saw the picture. Ethan had drawn 2 figures standing in front of a house. Just him and his dad. The sky was colored a deep blue, but there was something missing from the drawn family's faces. They weren't smiling. "That's really good, Ethan," Daniel said, his voice rough. "You're getting better at drawing." Ethan picked up a black pencil and started adding more details to the house. Tommy drew his whole family, his mom, dad, his little sister, and even their dog. He paused, the pencil hovering over the paper. "My picture looks empty." Daniel sat down on the floor beside his son, watching as Ethan's small hand gripped the pencil tighter. The simple drawing seemed to capture everything that was wrong in their world, the blank space where someone should be, the absence that neither of them knew how to fill. He reached out to touch Ethan's shoulder, but his son shrugged away, focusing intently on adding another window to the house. Daniel's hand fell helplessly to his side as he watched his son continue to draw, unable to find the words to make things better. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Joe's Diner, casting warm patches of light across the worn counter where Daniel Cooper sat. His work-stained hands wrapped around a white ceramic mug, shoulders slumped with exhaustion after a long morning at the auto shop. The diner buzzed with the usual lunch crowd, the clinking of silverware, murmured conversations, and the sizzle of the grill creating a familiar backdrop. Grace Miller approached with a fresh pot of coffee, her gentle smile brightening her tired eyes. Her brown hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her navy blue uniform was crisp despite the long shift. "Looks like you could use a refill," she said, already tipping the pot toward his cup. Daniel managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Grace. Rough morning. Had 3 transmissions to fix before noon. The usual sandwich, too?" She pulled out her notepad, though she already knew his order by heart. "Please. Turkey on rye, extra pickles." Grace nodded, writing it down anyway. "Coming right up. How's Ethan doing? Haven't seen him in here lately." "He's..." Daniel paused, running a hand through his hair. "He's hanging in there." Before Grace could respond, voices from a nearby booth caught Daniel's attention. 2 women he recognized as mothers from Ethan's school were having lunch, their voices carrying just enough for him to hear. "Did you hear about the family celebration night?" one woman whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Poor Ethan Cooper. He's the only one without a mother to come. It's just heartbreaking." "I know," the other replied. "My Sophie says he just sits alone at lunch sometimes, drawing pictures of his family. Such a shame." Daniel's face burned with a mixture of anger and shame. He stared down at his coffee, the dark liquid suddenly unappetizing. Grace had heard too. He could tell by the way she hesitated, her pen hovering above her notepad. "I'll get that sandwich started for you," she said softly, turning to go. "Wait." The word came out before Daniel could stop it. Grace paused, looking back at him with concern in her warm brown eyes. Daniel glanced around, then lowered his voice. Can you sit for a minute?" Grace checked over her shoulder. The diner was in its post-lunch lull, and her other tables were taken care of. She slid onto the stool next to him, setting her coffee pot aside. "What's on your mind, Daniel?" He took a deep breath, hardly believing what he was about to say. "This is going to sound crazy, but I have a favor to ask, a big one." Grace waited patiently while Daniel struggled to find the right words. "There's this event at Ethan's school next week. Family celebration night. All the kids are supposed to present projects about their families, and..." He swallowed hard. "The other kids have been giving him a hard time because he doesn't have a mom to bring." Understanding softened Grace's features. She'd been serving Daniel and Ethan for the past 2 years, watching the young boy grow while his father did his best to fill the void left by his mother's passing. "I was wondering, and please, feel free to say no, but would you..." Daniel's voice dropped even lower. "Would you consider pretending to be my wife, just for that one evening?" Grace's eyes widened, and she sat back slightly. "Oh, I know it's completely inappropriate to ask, Daniel rushed on, his face reddening. And probably wrong on about 10 different levels. But Ethan, he's having such a hard time. I just want him to have one normal night, where he doesn't have to feel different from everyone else. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the counter. The overhead fans whirred, and somewhere in the kitchen, a cook called out an order. When exactly is this event? She finally asked. Next Thursday evening, 7 o'clock. She bit her lower lip, considering. And it would just be for that one night? Daniel nodded quickly. Just the event. 2 hours max. I'd pay you, of course. No, Grace said firmly. If I do this, I won't take money for it. She looked over at the booth where the two mothers sat, then back at Daniel's desperate expression. I'll do it for Ethan. Relief flooded Daniel's face. Really? You will? Yes. Grace stood up, straightening her apron. But we should probably talk about the details. How we met, how long we've been together, that sort of thing. The kids will probably have questions. Right, of course. Daniel hadn't even thought that far ahead. Grace reached for a napkin and pulled a pen from her pocket. She scribbled something on it and slid it across to Daniel. Here's my number. Call me. We'll make this work. Daniel's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup truck, navigating through the quiet streets of their small town. The address Grace had given him led to a modest apartment complex on the east side. His heart pounded with each turn. This plan had seemed desperate yesterday, but now it felt absolutely crazy. He pulled up to the curb, checking his watch. 6:45 p.m. The family celebration night started at 7:30. Ethan sat in the back seat, practically bouncing with excitement, his project folder clutched tightly to his chest. Remember, buddy, Daniel said, turning to face his son. This is just for tonight, okay? Ethan nodded, but his eyes sparkled with an hope that made Daniel's chest tight. Grace emerged from the building, and Daniel's breath caught. She wore a simple blue dress that fell just below her knees, her honey blonde hair swept back with a clip. She looked nothing like the waitress in her diner uniform. She looked elegant, put together, like she could belong in their little family. The dress is borrowed from my neighbor, Grace explained as she slipped into the passenger seat, smoothing the fabric nervously. I hope it's appropriate? You look pretty. Ethan piped up from the back seat before Daniel could respond. Grace turned, giving Ethan a warm smile that reached her eyes. Thank you, sweetheart, and is this your project? May I see it? As Ethan proudly showed Grace his folder, Daniel navigated toward the school, stealing glances at them in the rearview mirror. The easy way Grace listened to Ethan's excited chatter, asking questions about his drawings, and nodding at all the right moments. It made something ache deep in his chest. The elementary school parking lot was already filling up when they arrived. Parents in their evening best led children through the double doors, everyone clutching projects and potluck dishes. Daniel helped Grace out of the truck, his hand lingering on her elbow perhaps a moment too long. Mommy, come see my classroom. Ethan grabbed Grace's hand without hesitation, tugging her forward. The word Mommy hung in the air between them, and Daniel saw Grace's eyes widen slightly, but she recovered quickly, letting Ethan lead the way. Inside, the school hallways buzzed with activity. Construction paper decorations proclaimed "Welcome Families" in bright colors, and the smell of coffee and cookies wafted from the cafeteria. Mrs. Peterson, Ethan's teacher, stood at the classroom door, greeting families. Oh, the Coopers! Mrs. Peterson's face lit up. You must be Mrs. Cooper. We've heard so much about you from Ethan. Grace's cheeks flushed pink, but she smiled warmly, shaking the teacher's hand. Please, call me Grace. They found their seats among the other families, Grace naturally taking the chair between Daniel and Ethan. Other parents nodded and smiled, a few introducing themselves. Daniel noticed how easily Grace fielded their questions, weaving simple answers that weren't quite lies, but weren't quite truth either. When it was Ethan's turn to present, he hesitated at the front of the room, his folder trembling slightly in his hands. Grace leaned forward, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. You've got this, sweetheart, she whispered, and something in her touch seemed to steady him. Ethan's presentation was about Heroes in my family. He'd drawn pictures of Daniel fixing cars, helping people whose vehicles had broken down. And there, on the last page, was a new drawing. A woman with honey blonde hair playing a piano, musical notes floating around her head like magic. "My mommy makes beautiful music," Ethan said proudly, and Daniel felt Grace stiffen beside him. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of applause, cookies, and conversation. Other parents complimented Ethan's artwork, asked Grace about her music, assumed they were a normal, happy family. Daniel found himself falling into the rhythm of it, letting himself pretend, just for a moment, that this wasn't all make-believe. As they walked back to the truck under a sky scattered with stars, Ethan skipped ahead, clutching his project and a handful of cookies wrapped in a napkin. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of late spring flowers from the school's garden. Grace walked close to Daniel, their shoulders occasionally brushing. "He did so well," she said softly. "You should be proud." "I am," Daniel replied, watching his son. "And thank you. For tonight. For everything." They reached the truck, and Daniel helped Ethan climb into the back seat. Grace stood by the passenger door, her borrowed dress silvery in the parking lot lights. That's when Ethan looked up, his eyes bright with innocence and hope. "Is she my new mommy?" he asked, the question hanging in the cool night air. Daniel froze, his hands still on the door handle. Grace stood absolutely still, her lips parted in surprise, as the weight of those 5 simple words settled over them all. The whispers rippled through the school hallway like a gentle breeze. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he watched several parents turn their heads, their eyes wide with curiosity. Mrs. Thompson, Ethan's teacher, smiled warmly at them, clearly having overheard the innocent question. "Well, isn't that sweet?" Mrs. Thompson said, her voice carrying just enough for the nearby parents to hear. Daniel forced a laugh, but it came out strained and awkward. "Kids say the darndest things, don't they?" He placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder, trying to guide him toward the exit. Grace, however, handled the moment with remarkable grace. She squeezed Ethan's hand and smiled down at him with genuine warmth. "Let's get you home, sweetheart. It's getting late." They walked through the school corridor together, looking every bit like the family Ethan wished they were. Daniel could hear the murmurs behind them, catching fragments of conversation. "Didn't know Cooper had remarried. Such a lovely woman. Just what that poor boy needed." The cool night air hit their faces as they stepped outside, and Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The parking lot was mostly empty now, their footsteps echoing against the asphalt. Once they were safely in Daniel's old sedan, Ethan's excitement from the evening caught up with him. His small head began to nod as they drove through the quiet streets of their town. Within minutes, soft snores came from the back seat. Grace twisted in her seat to look at the sleeping boy. "He's out cold," she whispered. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter. "We need to talk about what just happened in there." "I know." Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "Everyone thinks I'm your wife now." "This wasn't supposed to happen," Daniel said, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Ethan. "It was supposed to be one evening, one presentation, that's all." Grace turned to face him, her expression troubled in the dim light from passing street lamps. "We need to tell him the truth, Daniel. He's already getting attached." "Did you see his face tonight?" Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "He was so proud, so happy. I haven't seen him like that since." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Since your wife passed," Grace completed gently. "I understand that. But lying to him—" "Just until the school buzz dies down," Daniel insisted, glancing in the rear-view mirror at his sleeping son. "A few weeks at most. If we tell him now, right after tonight, it'll crush him. The other kids will start teasing him again." Grace ran her fingers through her hair, a gesture of frustration. "And what happens when those few weeks are up? The longer we wait, the harder it will be." They turned onto Daniel's street, the familiar houses dark and quiet. A cat darted across the road, its eyes reflecting their headlights. "I know it's not ideal," Daniel admitted, pulling into his driveway. "But I can't bear to see him hurt again. Not tonight. Not after seeing him so happy." Grace looked back at Ethan again, her expression softening. The boy had slumped against his seatbelt, his presentation folder still clutched in his small hands. "He's such a sweet kid," she murmured. Daniel turned off the engine, and the sudden silence felt heavy with unspoken words. "Will you help me get him inside?" Grace nodded, opening her door quietly. Together, they managed to unbuckle Ethan without waking him. Daniel lifted his son carefully, while Grace gathered Ethan's things from the car. They walked up the path to the house, their shadows stretching long in the porch light. Grace held the door open as Daniel carried Ethan inside, their movements synchronized like they'd done this 100 times before. In Ethan's room, Grace turned on the small dinosaur nightlight while Daniel laid his son on the bed. She stepped forward and gently removed Ethan's shoes, then pulled the covers up to his chin. Her hand lingered for a moment as she smoothed his hair back from his forehead. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching. The sight of Grace, tucking his son in with such tenderness, made his chest tight with conflicting emotions. Gratitude for her kindness warred with guilt over the deception they were perpetuating. The scene before him looked so right, yet he knew it was built on a lie. Ethan stirred slightly in his sleep, mumbling something that sounded like, "Mommy." Grace's hand trembled slightly as she withdrew it, and she turned to Daniel with tears shining in her eyes. They stepped out of the room, and Daniel pulled the door nearly closed, leaving it open just a crack the way Ethan liked it. In the hallway, the weight of their decision hung between them like a physical presence. The warm aroma of butter and maple syrup drifted through the Cooper household early Saturday morning. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, his nose twitching at the unfamiliar but delightful smell. Usually, weekends meant cold cereal or frozen waffles, his dad's go-to breakfast options. Padding down the hallway in his rocket ship pajamas, Ethan froze at the kitchen entrance. There stood Grace, her honey blonde hair tied back in a messy bun, wearing an old apron she'd found in a drawer. She was humming softly while flipping golden brown pancakes on the griddle. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Grace said, turning to face him with a warm smile. "You're here," Ethan exclaimed, his face lighting up like Christmas morning. He rushed forward and wrapped his arms around her waist, nearly causing her to drop the spatula. Daniel emerged from his bedroom, drawn by the commotion. He stopped short at the sight before him. Grace in his kitchen, his son hugging her, and a stack of perfectly round pancakes on the counter. His chest tightened with a mixture of guilt and something else he couldn't quite name. "I hope you don't mind," Grace said quickly, catching his expression. "I thought, well, after last night, maybe we should keep up appearances. And I brought fresh berries." "Family breakfast," Ethan declared, climbing onto his chair. "Dad, look, real pancakes." Daniel couldn't help but smile at his son's excitement. "This is unexpected, but thank you, Grace." They settled around the small kitchen table, passing plates and syrup. Ethan chatted animatedly about his plans to show Grace his rock collection and the treehouse in the backyard. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over their impromptu family scene. The doorbell rang just as they were finishing up. "I'll get it," Daniel said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He opened the front door to find Mrs. Parker, their next-door neighbor, holding a casserole dish. "Daniel Cooper!" she exclaimed, peering past him into the house. "I just had to stop by and meet your lovely wife. The whole neighborhood's been talking about how you kept this wonderful secret from us." Before Daniel could respond, Mrs. Parker had already bustled past him into the kitchen. Grace stood frozen by the sink, still wearing the apron, looking every bit the picture of domestic bliss. "Oh, how darling." Mrs. Parker clasped her hands together. "And making breakfast for your family? I brought you a welcome to the neighborhood casserole, dear, though I suppose you're not exactly new to the neighborhood, are you?" She winked conspiratorially. Grace recovered quickly, wiping her hands on the apron. "That's so thoughtful of you, Mrs. Parker. Thank you. Please, call me Betty." Mrs. Parker set the casserole on the counter. "We're just all so happy for Daniel and little Ethan. It's been too long since this house had a woman's touch." More neighbors dropped by throughout the morning. Word had spread fast in their small community. Mrs. Thompson from 2 doors down brought cookies. The Hendersons stopped by with their twins, who played with Ethan while the adults made awkward small talk. Each time, Grace played her part perfectly, graciously accepting congratulations and deflecting questions about their courtship with vague but charming responses. Daniel watched in amazement as she navigated the social minefield with ease. Between visitors, Ethan sat at the coffee table, colored pencils scattered around him. His tongue stuck out in concentration as he drew picture after picture. Each one featured 3 figures: a tall man with brown hair, a smaller boy, and a woman with golden hair. "Look." He held up his latest masterpiece. "It's us. Our family." Grace's smile faltered for just a moment. She glanced at Daniel, who was staring at the drawing with an unreadable expression. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Grace managed to say, her voice slightly strained. As the afternoon wore on, the stream of visitors finally slowed. Ethan, worn out from excitement and playing with the neighbor kids, fell asleep on the couch surrounded by his drawings. Daniel gestured toward the front porch. "We should talk." The evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine. Grace sat on the porch swing, while Daniel leaned against the railing, both of them watching the sun sink lower in the sky. "This is getting complicated," Daniel said finally, running a hand through his hair. Grace nodded, gently pushing the swing with her foot. "I know. The whole town thinks we're married now. We need to set a timeline," Daniel continued. "Maybe in a few weeks we can say you got a job offer somewhere else. Make it a clean break." "That would make sense," Grace agreed, though her voice lacked conviction. She watched a pair of cardinals flit between the trees. "Ethan seems so happy." Daniel's shoulders slumped. "Yeah, that's what makes this harder. But we can't keep pretending forever. It's not fair to anyone." "No, we can't," Grace said softly. They sat in silence for a moment, the porch swing creaking gently. The streetlights began to flicker on, one by one. A cool breeze carried the distant sound of children playing, of screen doors slamming, of life going on around them. Daniel looked at Grace, really looked at her, as she sat there in the fading light. She'd spent her whole Saturday helping maintain this charade, making his son happier than he'd been in years. Something stirred in his chest, an emotion he thought he'd buried long ago. Grace met his gaze, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The weight of unspoken words hung between them, heavy with possibility. Finally, Grace stood up, smoothing her skirt. "I should go. Early shift tomorrow at the diner." "Right," Daniel said, straightening up. "Thank you. For today. For everything." "Of course," she replied, her hand lingering on the porch railing. Just a little while longer, right?" "Right," Daniel echoed. "Just a little while." But as they looked at each other in the growing darkness, they both felt it, a pull, an ache, a whisper of something that felt dangerously close to hope. Something that made their agreement to end this charade soon feel like a lie bigger than the one they were already living. The following week brought changes to the Cooper household that felt as natural as breathing. Grace's presence wove seamlessly into their daily routines, filling empty spaces they hadn't even realized were there. Monday afternoon found Grace sitting at the kitchen table with Ethan, math worksheets spread before them. Daniel watched from the doorway as she patiently explained multiplication, using chocolate chips as counters. Her gentle voice carried across the room. "See? 3 groups of 4 chips makes 12, Grace demonstrated, arranging the treats in neat rows. "Just like your dad group's spark plugs in his shop." Ethan's face lit up with understanding. "Oh, like when he fixes cars." "Exactly," Grace beamed, ruffling his hair. "You're so smart, sweetheart." The word sweetheart hung in the air, so motherly and warm that Daniel's chest tightened. He quickly ducked back to his newspaper, pretending he hadn't been watching. On Wednesday, Grace arrived with grocery bags full of ingredients. "I thought we could make lasagna together," she announced. Daniel raised his eyebrows. He and Ethan had been living on simple meals since everything changed. Soon the kitchen filled with wonderful smells and laughter as Grace taught them her grandmother's recipe. Ethan wore an oversized apron, his face dusted with flour as he helped layer the pasta. Even Daniel found himself drawn in, chopping onions while Grace stirred the sauce. "A little more oregano," she guided, letting him taste from the wooden spoon. Their eyes met over the steaming pot, and something warm flickered between them that had nothing to do with cooking. Sunday morning brought another surprise. Grace was waiting outside the church when they arrived, dressed in a pretty blue dress. Ethan immediately grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the entrance. "Mom's here," he announced to Mrs. Peterson, the elderly greeter. Daniel tensed, waiting for questions. But Grace handled it with grace, greeting the woman with a warm smile and genuine interest in the church's history. During the service, Ethan nestled between them in the pew, content in a way Daniel hadn't seen in years. The pastor's words about family and healing seemed to echo directly into Daniel's heart. But it was Thursday when everything shifted. Ethan had been exploring the attic, supposedly looking for his old baseball mitt. Instead, he came thundering down the stairs, excitement making his words tumble out. "Mom, we found Grandma's keyboard. Dad says you play piano. Will you show us?" Grace's eyes widened at the dusty electronic keyboard Ethan dragged into the living room. "Oh, I haven't played in so long. Please?" Ethan's hopeful face worked its magic. Daniel plugged in the keyboard, while Grace wiped it clean with trembling hands. "It might be out of tune," she warned, but her fingers were already hovering over the keys. The first notes were hesitant, like a bird testing its wings. Then, slowly, a melody emerged, something soft and sweet that Daniel didn't recognize. Grace's shoulders relaxed as she played, her face transformed by a private joy. The music filled their home, wrapping around them like a warm embrace. Daniel watched her hands dance across the keys, telling stories without words. Tears pricked at his eyes, catching him off guard. He hadn't expected to feel this ache of beauty and loss and possibility all mixed together. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, entranced. When Grace finished, he clapped enthusiastically. "That was amazing. You have to teach me. Maybe we could start with 'Mary Had a Little Lamb.'" Grace laughed, patting the space beside her on the bench. As she guided Ethan's small fingers over the keys, Daniel slipped away to the kitchen, needing a moment to collect himself. That evening, after dinner and dishes, Grace volunteered to put Ethan to bed. Daniel heard their voices floating down the hallway. Grace reading "Where the Wild Things Are," with all the right dramatic pauses, Ethan's delighted giggles at her monster voices. He found himself drawn to Ethan's doorway, watching as Grace tucked the blanket around his son's shoulders. She smoothed his hair back, just like Sarah used to do. "Good night, sweetheart," Grace whispered, placing a gentle kiss on Ethan's forehead. "Night, Mom," Ethan mumbled sleepily, already drifting off. Daniel stepped back into the hallway, his heart full and heavy at once. The sight of them together stirred something he'd buried deep, a longing he'd denied himself permission to feel. In the quiet darkness of the hallway, Daniel closed his eyes. His lips moved in a prayer he hadn't dared to speak since Sarah died. "Lord, am I allowed to feel hope again?" Mrs. Thompson's fourth-grade classroom buzzed with excitement as she announced the winners of the monthly writing contest. Ethan Cooper sat at his desk, fingers drumming nervously on his notebook while his teacher held up 3 decorated certificates. "And first prize goes to..." Mrs. Thompson paused for dramatic effect. "Ethan Cooper for his touching essay, 'My New Mommy.'" The class erupted in applause. Ethan's face flushed red as he walked to the front of the room to accept his certificate. The gold star sticker gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Would you like to read it to the class?" Mrs. Thompson asked gently. Ethan nodded, unfolding his carefully written pages. His voice started quiet but grew stronger with each word. "My New Mommy," by Ethan Cooper. "Grace is my new mommy, and she makes everything better. She knows how to make pancakes with chocolate chips in funny shapes, and she never gets mad when I spill the syrup. When I'm stuck on my math homework, she uses candy to help me count, and sometimes we get to eat the candy after. But the most special thing about my new mommy is her music. She plays the piano like angels singing. Sometimes when I'm supposed to be sleeping, I hear her playing downstairs with Daddy listening. The music floats up to my room like a lullaby. She laughs a lot too. Not the fake kind of laugh that grown-ups use sometimes, but real laughs that make her eyes crinkle up. She makes Daddy laugh too, which he didn't do much before. My new mommy knows exactly how to tuck me in at night, with the blanket folded just right under my chin. She reads stories using different voices for all the characters, even the scary ones. And she always kisses my forehead twice, once for sweet dreams and once for love. When I get scared during thunderstorms, she makes hot chocolate with extra marshmallows and tells me stories about when she was little. She says being scared is okay because even grown-ups get scared sometimes. I think she was sent to us by my first mommy in heaven, because my first mommy would want us to be happy, and Grace makes us happy every single day. The best part is how she looks at my daddy, like he's the most important person in the whole world, and how he looks at her the same way when he thinks nobody's watching. I used to feel different from other kids because I didn't have a mommy, but now I have the best mommy anyone could ask for. She chose to be my mommy, and that makes it even more special. When Ethan finished reading, Mrs. Thompson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Several students sniffled. Even Tommy Martinez, who usually made fun of emotional stuff, looked touched. Later that afternoon, Principal Roberts called Daniel at his auto shop. "Mr. Cooper, I just had to tell you personally how moved we all were by Ethan's essay. It's rare to see such emotional depth from an 8-year-old. Daniel's wrench clattered to the floor. "His essay? Oh yes, about your wife Grace. Such a beautiful tribute to blended families and second chances. In fact, the local paper called, they'd love to do a feature on your family. They think it would make an inspiring story for the community." Daniel's mouth went dry. "The paper wants to." "Yes. They're particularly interested in how Grace has helped Ethan process his grief. They'd like to do interviews, take some family photos. Isn't it wonderful?" Daniel managed to mumble something about calling them back before hanging up. His hands shook as he dialed Grace's number at the diner. "We have a problem," he said when she answered. "A big one." That evening, after Ethan was asleep, Grace sat on the Coopers' worn living room couch with Ethan's essay in her hands. Her eyes moved over each carefully printed word, tears rolling down her cheeks. "She plays the piano like angels singing," she read aloud, her voice catching. "She makes Daddy laugh too, which he didn't do much before." Daniel paced the room, running his fingers through his hair. "What are we going to do? The whole town will want to know our story. They'll want pictures, interviews." But Grace wasn't listening. She continued reading through her tears. "I think she was sent to us by my first mommy in heaven, because my first mommy would want us to be happy, and Grace makes us happy every single day." She looked up at Daniel, her eyes shining with tears. He stopped pacing, caught by the raw emotion in her face. The living room lamp cast a soft glow around her, highlighting the gentle curves of her face, the slight tremble of her lips as she read the final lines. "She chose to be my mommy," Grace's voice broke completely. "And that makes it even more special." The essay fluttered to her lap as she covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Daniel moved without thinking, sitting beside her on the couch. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I never meant," Grace whispered. "I never meant to become so important to him, to either of you." Daniel's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. When she finally looked up at him, the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words. Her eyes searched his face, asking questions neither of them dared voice aloud. They sat there in the quiet living room, hands clasped, hearts pounding, while Ethan's essay lay between them, every word filled with an 8-year-old's pure, unquestioning love. The community center's old brick walls seemed to glow in the warm evening light. Inside, metal folding chairs creaked as people settled in for the monthly music night. Ethan bounced excitedly in his seat next to Daniel, his small hand clutching a wrinkled program. "And next up," announced Mrs. Baker, the elderly program coordinator, "we have a special treat. Grace Miller will be playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata." Grace's hands trembled as she stood from her seat. Daniel gave her an encouraging nod, while Ethan flashed her a thumbs up. She hadn't touched a piano in public since that devastating night 5 years ago when her ex-fiancé had left her just before her big conservatory audition. The community center's upright piano wasn't fancy. Its oak finish was scratched, and a few keys stuck occasionally. But as Grace settled onto the bench, it felt like coming home. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let her fingers find their place on the cool ivory keys. The first notes filled the room, soft and hesitant, like morning dew. But as the familiar melody wrapped around her, Grace's confidence grew. Her hands danced across the keys, drawing out the haunting beauty of Beethoven's masterpiece. The audience sat transfixed as the music swelled and ebbed, telling its story of moonlight and shadows, of loss and hope. Ethan watched with wide eyes, pride shining on his face. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off Grace, the way she swayed slightly with the music, how her face softened into an expression of pure peace. In that moment, she was radiant. When the final notes faded away, there was a beat of silence before the room erupted in applause. Grace opened her eyes, looking slightly dazed, as if waking from a dream. Someone in the back shouted, "Encore!" and soon others joined in. With a shy smile, Grace launched into a playful rendition of Heart and Soul. Ethan giggled and ran up to join her on the bench, adding his own simple part to the duet, just as she'd taught him last week. After the music night ended, Daniel suggested a walk around the neighborhood. The spring evening was perfect, just cool enough for light jackets, with stars beginning to peek through the twilight sky. "That was beautiful," Daniel said softly, as they strolled past gardens buzzing with early fireflies. "I haven't seen Ethan so happy in a very long time." Grace hugged her arms around herself, still floating on the high of performing again. "He's such a special boy. You've done an amazing job with him, Daniel. We both know. I've been barely holding it together." Daniel's voice was rough with emotion. "But since you came, everything's brighter somehow. Warmer." They stopped under an old maple tree, its new leaves rustling gently overhead. Grace turned to face Daniel, her heart pounding. His eyes met hers, full of something that made her breath catch. He took a half-step closer. Time seemed to slow down as Daniel's hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her cheek. Grace tilted her face up slightly, hardly daring to breathe. Their faces drew closer, the space between them electric with possibility. But at the last moment, they both pulled back, suddenly nervous. Grace looked down at her shoes while Daniel cleared his throat. "We should probably head back," he said quietly. "It's getting late." The walk home was filled with shy glances and things left unsaid. When they reached the house, Ethan was waiting up despite Mrs. Martinez, their elderly neighbor, insisting it was past his bedtime. After good nights were exchanged and Grace had left, Ethan knelt beside his bed in Superman pajamas. Through the crack in his door, he clasped his small hands together and whispered into the darkness, "Please, God, let her stay forever." The morning sun streamed through the windows of Pete's Diner, catching the chrome edges of the coffee pots and making them sparkle. Grace moved between tables with her usual warm smile, refilling cups and taking orders. Everything felt normal until she heard a familiar voice that made her blood run cold. Well, if it isn't Grace Miller, playing house with the local mechanic. Grace turned slowly to face Mark Reynolds, who stood near the entrance with his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mark," she whispered, nearly dropping her coffee pot. "What are you doing here? Can't I check up on my former fiancée?" He spoke loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "Especially when I hear she's suddenly married to some widower?" Mrs. Parker, sitting at her usual corner table, stopped mid-bite of her toast. Her eyes darted between Grace and Mark. "Please," Grace said quietly. "Not here." Mark stepped closer, his voice dripping with fake concern. "These good people deserve to know the truth, don't they? About how you're pretending to be Mrs. Cooper, when you're not even married to the man?" The diner fell silent. Forks stopped clinking against plates. All eyes turned to Grace, whose face had gone pale. "That's right, folks," Mark announced, spreading his arms. "It's all a lie. Grace here is no more Mrs. Cooper than I am. Just ask her." Grace's hands shook as she set down the coffee pot. She couldn't meet anyone's eyes, especially Mrs. Parker's, who was already pulling out her phone, no doubt ready to spread the news. "I should go," Grace managed to say, untying her apron with trembling fingers. "Running away again?" Mark called after her. "Just like you ran from our engagement?" Grace hurried to the back room, tears blurring her vision. By the time she emerged in her street clothes, The diner was buzzing with whispers. She could feel their judgment, their disapproval. The news spread through the small town like wildfire. By lunchtime, it had reached the elementary school, where Ethan was having recess. "Hey, Cooper," a boy called out. "Is it true your fake mom's not really your mom?" Ethan stopped climbing the jungle gym, his small hands gripping the metal bars tightly. "What?" "My mom just texted my teacher," another kid chimed in. "She said your dad's girlfriend was pretending to be married to him. That's weird." Ethan slid down the slide and ran inside the school building, ignoring his teacher's calls. He found a quiet corner in the library and pulled out his phone, the one his dad had given him for emergencies only. With shaking fingers, he called Grace. Grace was walking home when her phone rang. Seeing Ethan's number made her heart ache. "Ethan, honey, is it true?" His voice was small and hurt. "Did you lie about being my mommy?" Grace closed her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Ethan, I care about you so much." "You promised?" His voice cracked. "You promised you were mommy. You helped me with homework and made pancakes and tucked me in at night." "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered. "I never meant to hurt you. I hate you," Ethan sobbed. "I hate you for lying." The call ended abruptly. Grace stood on the sidewalk, clutching her phone to her chest, feeling as if her heart was being torn apart. That afternoon, when Daniel came to pick up Ethan from school, his son was unusually quiet. They drove home in silence until Ethan suddenly spoke up. "Why did you and Grace lie to me?" Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Who told you?" "Everyone knows," Ethan shouted. "The whole school knows she's not really my mom. You both lied." As they pulled into their driveway, they saw Grace waiting on the front porch. Ethan jumped out of the car before it fully stopped and ran past her into the house. "Ethan, please." Grace reached for him, but he was already gone. The sound of his bedroom door slamming echoed through the house. Daniel got out of the car slowly, his face tight with anger and pain. "This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. Daniel, I'm sorry. Mark showed up at the diner." "Your ex-fiancé?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Perfect. Just perfect." "I never meant for any of this to happen," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I care about you both so much." "That's the problem." Daniel's voice rose. "You got too involved. We should have ended this after that first school night. But you kept coming around, making Ethan believe in something that wasn't real." "It felt real to me," Grace whispered. "Well, it wasn't," Daniel snapped. "I'm a widower with a son who's now more hurt than ever, and you're just someone who played pretend for too long." The words hit Grace like physical blows. She took a step back, tears streaming down her face. "You're right," she said quietly. "I should go." She turned and walked to her car, where she'd already packed a small suitcase in the trunk. She'd known somehow that it would end like this. That happiness wasn't meant for someone like her. Daniel watched her drive away, his anger slowly giving way to an emptiness that felt worse than grief. From inside the house, he could hear Ethan's muffled sobs. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street where neighbors peeked through their curtains, whispering about the scandal of the day. The perfect family image they'd created had shattered, leaving behind only broken pieces and broken hearts. The morning light crept through Daniel's kitchen window, casting long shadows across the empty chairs at the breakfast table. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. A plate of untouched scrambled eggs sat in front of Ethan's usual spot, growing cold. "Ethan?" Daniel called softly up the stairs. "Breakfast is ready, buddy." No answer came. Daniel's shoulders slumped as he heard the familiar sound of Ethan's bedroom door closing. The house felt different now, hollow, like something vital had been scooped out of it. The warmth that had filled these rooms just days ago when Grace was here had vanished, leaving behind an emptiness that seemed to echo with every footstep. Daniel climbed the stairs slowly, his work boots heavy on each step. Outside Ethan's room, scattered across the floor, were the crumpled remains of his latest drawings. Daniel picked one up, carefully smoothing out the wrinkled paper. It showed 3 stick figures, a family, but the tallest female figure had been violently scribbled out with black crayon. "Son?" Daniel knocked gently. "You need to eat something." "I'm not hungry," came the muffled reply. Daniel pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the door. "We need to talk about what happened." "Go away." The words stung, but Daniel couldn't blame him. He'd let his son down in the worst way possible by giving him hope and then watching it crumble. Across town, in her small apartment above the flower shop, Grace sat at her old upright piano. Sheet music lay scattered around her feet, but she hadn't played a note. Her fingers hovered over the ivory keys, trembling slightly. The same keys that had once brought such joy now seemed to mock her. "Lord," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't know where I belong anymore." Tears fell onto the piano keys as memories flooded back Ethan's face, lighting up when she made pancakes, Daniel's gentle smile across the dinner table, the way the three of them had fit together so naturally. She'd allowed herself to believe in that dream, to imagine herself as part of their family. Now, it felt like a cruel joke. Grace pressed a single key, the note hanging in the air like a question. "I never meant to hurt them," she prayed. I just wanted to belong somewhere, to someone." Back at the Cooper house, Daniel found himself standing in the doorway of their living room. The space felt wrong now. The cushions on the couch were too neat, no longer bearing the indent where Grace would sit to help Ethan with his homework. The kitchen counter was spotless, missing the light dusting of flour from their baking adventures. Even the air seemed stale, having lost the faint scent of her perfume. He picked up the phone 3 times that morning, scrolling to Grace's number, but couldn't bring himself to press call. What could he possibly say? He'd blamed her for his own choices, pushed her away when she'd done nothing but bring light into their darkness. Later that afternoon, Daniel drove to Ethan's school alone. The parking lot was full of cars, parents streaming into the building for the spring project presentations. He spotted Mrs. Henderson, Ethan's teacher, giving him a look that mixed pity with disappointment. Inside the classroom, chairs had been arranged in neat rows. Parents chatted in small groups, their voices dropping to whispers as Daniel walked past. He caught fragments of their conversations. "Can't believe they lied to everyone. Poor Ethan. What kind of example?" Daniel's face burned with shame, but he kept walking until he reached Ethan, who sat alone in the corner. His project board lay face down on the desk. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said softly. "Ready to show everyone your work?" Ethan shook his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't want to, but you worked so hard on it. It's about families," Ethan cut him off, his voice thick with tears. "And we're not a real family anymore." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He knelt beside his son's desk, trying to meet his eyes. "Ethan, look at me. We are a real family. You and me. But I want Grace," Ethan burst out, loud enough for nearby parents to turn and stare. "You made her leave. You promised she was my mom, and then you made her go away." Daniel felt the weight of every stare in the room. The whispers grew louder, and Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, clearly preparing to intervene. But Daniel barely noticed. All he could see was the pain in his son's eyes, pain he had caused with his well-intentioned deception. "I know," he whispered, his voice rough. "I know. I messed up, son. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong." Ethan's lower lip trembled. "I miss her." "Me too," Daniel admitted. And it felt like letting go of a breath he'd been holding for days. "Me too." When Mrs. Henderson called Ethan's name for his presentation, the boy just shook his head again. She moved on to the next student, but Daniel hardly heard the other presentations. He sat there, his son's small hand clutched in his, feeling the full weight of his choices. The classroom walls were covered with family photos and drawings, smiling parents, siblings, pets. Each one seemed to highlight what was missing in their lives, what they'd briefly found with Grace, and what Daniel's fear and pride had cost them. As other children stood up one by one to share their projects about their families, Daniel watched his son shrink further into himself. The sparkle that had returned to Ethan's eyes during Grace's time with them had disappeared completely, replaced by a dullness that broke Daniel's heart. A young girl presented her project about her blended family, talking about how love makes a family, not just blood. Daniel felt each word like a knife to his heart. They'd had that a chance at real love, at being a true family, and he'd thrown it away, because he was too proud to admit they needed help, too scared to acknowledge that his heart had begun to heal. The truth, hit him with stunning clarity. In trying to protect his son from pain, he'd caused even more. In attempting to maintain appearances, he'd destroyed something genuine and precious that had been growing among them. As the presentations continued, Daniel sat there, holding his son's hand, surrounded by the whispers and stares of other parents, feeling every bit the fraud they thought he was. But worse than their judgment was the knowledge that he'd failed. The two people who mattered most, his son, who needed love and stability, and Grace, who had given them both so freely, asking nothing in return but to belong. The classroom buzzed with whispers as Daniel Cooper stood at the front, his hands gripping the wooden podium. Sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, casting long shadows across the faces of parents and children seated in neat rows. His throat felt tight, but he forced himself to look up at the expectant faces. "I owe everyone here an apology," Daniel began, his voice rough with emotion. "Especially my son, Ethan." He looked directly at his boy, who sat hunched in his chair, refusing to meet his eyes. Mrs. Peterson, Ethan's teacher, gave Daniel an encouraging nod. The classroom fell silent, hanging on his every word. 5 years ago, I lost my wife, Ethan's mother, to cancer. Daniel's hands trembled slightly on the podium. She was the kindest, most loving person I've ever known. When she died, it felt like the light went out of our world. A few parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some dabbed at their eyes with tissues. I thought I was protecting Ethan by being strong, by never showing how much it hurt. Daniel's voice cracked. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of feeling that pain again. Scared of letting anyone else into our lives. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. When the family celebration night came up, I made a terrible choice. Instead of being honest about our situation, I asked someone, a kind and wonderful person named Grace, to pretend to be Ethan's mother. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Ethan sank lower in his chair, but Daniel noticed his son's shoulders trembling. I convinced myself it was to protect Ethan from being teased, from feeling different. Daniel shook his head. But really, I was protecting myself. I was too proud to admit that we were struggling, that we needed help, that we needed to love. Mrs. Peterson handed Daniel a tissue, which he accepted gratefully. Grace came into our lives like a gift we didn't know we needed. She brought music back into our home. She helped Ethan with his homework. She made us laugh again. Daniel's voice grew stronger, but instead of being honest about how much she meant to us, I kept up the lie, and when the truth came out, I blamed her instead of taking responsibility for my own actions. He stepped away from the podium, walking closer to where Ethan sat. "Son, I'm so sorry. I should have trusted that you were strong enough to handle the truth. I should have believed that our community would understand and support us." Ethan's small shoulders shook harder as silent tears ran down his cheeks. "The truth is," Daniel continued, addressing the whole room now, "sometimes families don't look the way we expect them to. Sometimes they're broken and need healing. Sometimes the people who become our family aren't the ones we're born to, but the ones who choose us, who love us despite our mistakes." The room was completely silent now, every person hanging on Daniel's words. I stand here today asking for forgiveness from my son, from this community, and especially from Grace, wherever she is, because she taught me that love isn't something to hide from or pretend about. It's something to be grateful for, in whatever form it comes. Daniel wiped his eyes. "So that's our truth. We're not perfect. We're just a father and son who lost someone precious, and we're blessed with someone new who helped us remember how to hope again." A movement at the back of the classroom caught everyone's attention. There, standing quietly in the doorway, was Grace. Her eyes were red from crying, but she wore a gentle smile that lit up her entire face. "Grace!" Ethan's voice cracked as he jumped up from his chair. He ran down the aisle between the desks, his small feet pounding against the linoleum floor. Grace knelt down, opening her arms wide as Ethan crashed into her embrace. His sobs echoed through the silent classroom as he buried his face in her shoulder. "I don't care if you're fake or real," Ethan cried, his words muffled against her sweater. "You're mommy to me." Grace held him tighter, her own tears falling freely now as she stroked his hair. The entire classroom watched the scene unfold, many wiping away tears of their own at the raw emotion of the moment. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the school playground as families filtered out of the building. Some lingered, casting curious glances at Daniel, Grace, and Ethan, who stood quietly by the old oak tree near the entrance. The fresh spring air carried the scent of blooming dogwoods, a stark contrast to the heavy emotions hanging between them. Ethan sat on a nearby bench, his small legs swinging back and forth as he watched a group of sparrows pecking at breadcrumbs. His eyes were still red from crying, but a tentative smile had found its way back to his face. Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands deep in his pockets. Grace stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself like a shield. The silence between them felt thick with unspoken words. "I don't even know where to begin," Daniel finally said, his voice rough with emotion. He pulled one hand from his pocket and ran it through his hair, a nervous gesture Grace had come to recognize over their time together. "You don't have to say anything," Grace replied softly, looking down at her worn ballet flats. "What you said in there? It was enough." "No," Daniel shook his head firmly. "It wasn't enough. Not even close." He took a step closer to her, close enough that she could see the tears gathering in his eyes. "Grace, I've been such a fool." She looked up at him then, her own eyes glistening. "We both made mistakes, Daniel. I should have known better than to—" "Please," he interrupted gently. "Let me finish. I need to say this." Grace nodded, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. "When Sarah died," Daniel's voice cracked slightly on his late wife's name, "I thought that was it for me. I told myself I had to be strong for Ethan, that I didn't need anyone else. I built walls so high I couldn't even see over them anymore." A gentle breeze rustled the oak leaves above them. From the bench, Ethan had stopped watching the birds and was now intently focused on his father and Grace. "But then you came along," Daniel continued, taking another step closer. "You didn't try to break down those walls. You just found your way through them somehow, with your kindness, your music, your way with Ethan." He gestured toward his son, who beamed at the mention of his name. "At first I told myself it was just pretend, that we were doing this for Ethan's sake." Daniel's voice grew stronger, more certain. "But somewhere along the way, it stopped being pretend for me. The way you'd hum, while helping Ethan with his homework, how you'd leave little notes in his lunchbox, the sound of your piano filling our house with music again." Grace's arms slowly dropped to her sides, her defensive posture melting away as Daniel spoke. "When everything fell apart, I did what I always do. I pushed away the person who was getting too close. I blamed you because it was easier than admitting how scared I was." Daniel wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "Scared of feeling something real again. Scared of loving someone and possibly losing them." "Daniel," Grace whispered, her voice trembling. He reached out and took her hands in his, and they were both surprised to find they were shaking. "Grace Miller, I don't want you to be my fake wife anymore." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, fear flickered across her face, but Daniel wasn't finished. "I want you to be real. Real in our lives, real in our home, real in our hearts." His grip on her hands tightened slightly. "I want to wake up every morning knowing you'll be there to help Ethan with his toast and eggs. I want to hear you playing the piano while I'm fixing dinner. I want to watch you tuck him in at night, and know that you're not leaving afterward." Tears were flowing freely down Grace's cheeks now. "But what about the past?" Daniel shook his head. "The past is what makes us who we are. Sarah will always be part of our story. Your previous engagement, my grief, they're chapters that led us here, but they don't have to be the end of the story." From the bench, Ethan had stood up and was slowly walking toward them, hope written across his young face. "I'm not asking you to be Sarah's replacement," Daniel continued softly. "I'm asking you to be you. The woman who brought light back into our home, who taught us it was okay to laugh again, who showed me that love isn't something you get only once in life." Grace's lower lip trembled as she struggled to find words. "But the town, the gossip." "Let them talk," Daniel said firmly. "I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending. I want to build something real with you, Grace. Something honest and true, for all three of us." Ethan had reached them now, slipping his small hand into Grace's free one. She looked down at him, then back at Daniel, her eyes full of tears, but also something else. Hope. The truth is, Daniel's voice grew softer, meant just for her. I think I've been falling in love with you since that first day at the diner, when you kept refilling my coffee and telling me terrible jokes just to make me smile. A small laugh escaped Grace's lips, mixed with a sob. They weren't that terrible. They really were, Daniel smiled, reaching up to wipe a tear from her cheek. But they worked. You worked your way into our lives, into our hearts, and now I can't imagine our family without you. Grace looked at their joined hands, then at Ethan's hopeful face, and finally back to Daniel's eyes. She saw the truth there, the love, the promise of something real and lasting. Yes, she whispered, nodding as more tears fell. Yes to being real. Yes to being family. Yes to all of it. Ethan let out a whoop of joy, throwing his arms around both their waists. Daniel pulled them both close, and for a long moment they just stood there, holding each other under the oak tree. When they finally pulled apart, Daniel took Grace's hand in his right, and Ethan's in his left. Grace reached down to take Ethan's other hand, completing the circle. Together, they began walking toward home, not as a pretend family, but as a real one, bound together by love, truth, and the courage to begin again. Daniel sat at his kitchen table early Sunday morning, watching the steam rise from his coffee cup. The morning light filtered through the curtains Grace had hung last week. Simple cream-colored ones that made the room feel warmer somehow. The house felt different now, less like a shelter and more like a home. I stopped going after Sarah died, Daniel said quietly, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. Grace sat across from him, her own coffee growing cold. Every hymn, every prayer. It just reminded me of her, of everything we lost. Grace reached across the table and placed her hand over his. I understand loss, she said softly. When my music career fell apart, I felt like God had abandoned me too. Tell me about that, Daniel said, turning his hand to hold hers properly. You never really explained what happened. Grace took a deep breath. I was going to be a concert pianist, had scholarships, played in competitions since I was 12. Then I met Mark. She paused, pain flickering across her face. He convinced me to leave school, said we'd build a life together. I believed him, used my savings to help him start a business. Then one day, he was just gone, along with all the money. I'm so sorry, Daniel whispered, squeezing her hand. I couldn't afford to go back to school. Ended up waitressing too, ashamed to even touch a piano for years. Every time I saw one, I remembered everything I'd lost. She smiled sadly. Until Ethan found that old keyboard in your attic. From upstairs came the sound of Ethan stirring, followed by his footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas, his hair tousled from sleep. Are we still going to church? He asked, rubbing his eyes. Daniel and Grace exchanged glances. Yes, Daniel said firmly. We are. Later that morning, they sat together in the third pew of First Baptist Church. Daniel felt the familiar weight of memories, Sarah singing beside him, baby Ethan sleeping in his arms. But somehow, they didn't crush him anymore. Grace's presence beside him felt right, like a gentle reminder that healing was possible. The following weeks brought changes to their home, small but significant. Grace taught Ethan to make his grandmother's cookie recipe, flour dusting their clothes as they laughed together in the kitchen. She helped him with his homework at the dining room table, explaining fractions with patience Daniel hadn't known he possessed. The old keyboard found a permanent home in the living room. Some evenings, Grace would play while Daniel fixed dinner, the gentle melodies filling their home with warmth. She started teaching Ethan simple songs, Heart and Soul, Chopsticks, his small fingers carefully picking out the notes while she encouraged him. One evening, Daniel came home from work to find them practicing together. Ethan sat beside Grace on the piano bench, his face scrunched in concentration as he played a simple melody. Grace watched him with such tenderness it made Daniel's heart ache. That's it, she said softly. Now try it again, Just a little slower. Ethan's fingers moved carefully over the keys, the notes coming clearer this time. When he finished, he looked up at Grace with pure joy. "I did it!" "You sure did, sweetheart." She hugged him close, dropping a kiss on top of his head. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching them. The setting sun painted the room in soft gold, and in that moment he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. His son was laughing again, really laughing. The house was full of music and warmth and love. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for second chances," he whispered, so quietly only he could hear. The piano keys tinkled again, as Ethan started another practice session, Grace's gentle guidance mixing with his determined efforts. Daniel stayed in the doorway, soaking in the moment, letting the music wash over him like a healing balm. The community center buzzed with activity on a bright Saturday morning. Children's voices echoed through the halls, mixed with the sound of various pianos being tuned. Grace stood in the newly renovated music room, arranging sheet music on 5 different stands. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her dress. This was her first official day as the center's piano teacher. Miss Grace. A little girl with pigtails bounded through the door, followed by her mother. "I brought my own music book, just like you said." Grace's face lit up. "That's wonderful, Sarah Beth. We'll start with those simple exercises we talked about." More students filtered in with their parents, filling the room with chatter and excitement. Grace noticed some of the mothers who had once whispered about her at the grocery store now smiled warmly, helping their children settle onto piano benches. Mrs. Thompson, who had been particularly critical during the scandal, approached Grace with an outstretched hand. "We're so fortunate to have someone with your talent teaching our children," she said sincerely. "The center hasn't had a proper music program in years." Above them, the sound of hammering echoed through the ceiling. Daniel and several other men from town were up on the roof, fixing the leaks that had plagued the building for months. Grace smiled, knowing Daniel was up there partly to support her new venture and partly to make amends with the community. "All right, everyone," Grace called out, clapping her hands. "Let's start with proper posture. Sit up straight, feet flat on the floor." The morning passed in a blur of scales, simple tunes, and encouraging words. Grace moved from student to student, gently correcting finger positions and praising their efforts. She noticed how some parents lingered, watching their children's faces light up when they managed to play a simple melody correctly. During the lunch break, Daniel came down from the roof, his t-shirt damp with sweat. He found Grace in the break room, where she was quickly eating a sandwich. "How's it going up there?" she asked, offering him half her lunch. "Good," he said, accepting the sandwich gratefully. "Tom and Bill are actually talking to me again. We're making progress on both the roof and the relationships, I guess." Grace squeezed his hand. "They see you're trying to make things right. That matters." "And down here?" he asked, nodding toward the music room. "It's..." Grace's eyes welled up unexpectedly. "It's everything I dreamed of, Daniel. These kids, their excitement when they learn something new. It's like I'm rediscovering my love for music through their eyes." Through the window, they could see Ethan in the playground, showing Sarah Beth how to play hopscotch. He looked happier than he had in months, proud that his mom was the new piano teacher. The afternoon brought more students, including some teenagers who wanted to learn popular songs. Grace adapted her teaching style for each student, finding ways to make the lessons engaging and fun. By the end of the day, 3 more parents had signed their children up for classes. Mr. Jenkins, the center's director, stopped by as Grace was gathering her things. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, beaming. "A real music program, bringing life back to this old place. And with Daniel fixing things up too, well, you Coopers are becoming quite the blessing to our community." Up on the roof, Daniel and the other men were finishing up for the day. Bill Peterson, who hadn't spoken directly to Daniel since the truth came out, finally broke the ice. "You know," he said, hammering in one last nail, "what you did wasn't right, but how you've handled it since then, owning up to it, making things right, that takes guts." "Thanks, Bill," Daniel replied quietly. "I'm trying," Tom Wheeler nodded in agreement. "And that Grace of yours, she's good people. Those kids down there adore her already." They climbed down as the sun began to set, the roof finally watertight. Daniel's muscles ached, but it was a good kind of tired. He found Grace and Ethan waiting for him in the parking lot, both wearing matching smiles. At home that evening, they sat around the kitchen table eating spaghetti and meatballs, Grace's specialty. Ethan couldn't stop talking about how cool it was to have a mom who taught piano and how Sarah Beth had said she was the best teacher ever. "And did you see me showing her hopscotch, Dad? She didn't even know how to play." Ethan's fork waved enthusiastically as he spoke. "Careful with that fork, buddy," Daniel chuckled. "You'll take someone's eye out." Grace told them about her favorite moments from the day. A shy little boy who finally found the courage to play in front of others. A teenage girl who discovered she could learn her favorite pop song on piano. "You should have seen their faces," she said, her eyes sparkling. "It was like watching flowers bloom." Daniel shared stories from the roof. How Tom had accidentally sat on a tar patch. How Bill's hat had blown off and landed in a tree. Each story made Ethan laugh harder, until he was holding his sides and gasping for breath. Grace got up to clear the plates, but Daniel gently pulled her back down. "Let's just sit here a while," he said softly. The kitchen was warm and comfortable, filled with the lingering smell of garlic bread and the sound of their mingled laughter. Looking at his son's joyful face and Grace's gentle smile, Daniel felt something settle in his chest. The empty spaces in their home, the quiet corners where grief had lived for so long, were finally full again. Not with memories of what they'd lost, but with the promise of what they'd found. Ethan launched into another story about his day, his hands gesturing wildly as he described a game of tag. Grace leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her waist. Their kitchen, once just a place to eat hurried meals between work and school, had become the heart of their home, a place where love and laughter flowed as naturally as breathing. The evening sun cast long shadows through the community center's windows as families filed into the newly renovated auditorium. Wooden chairs creaked under the weight of parents and grandparents settling in, while excited whispers filled the air. A hand-painted banner hung above the stage. First Annual Family Music Night. Grace stood backstage, smoothing the wrinkles from her navy blue dress. Her fingers ghosted over the piano keys of the upright Baldwin, a recent donation from one of her students' families. 20 children fidgeted in their Sunday best, waiting for their moment to perform. "Mrs. Cooper!" 8-year-old Sarah tugged at Grace's sleeve. "I'm scared I'll mess up the song." Grace knelt beside the little girl, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "Remember what we practiced? Just pretend you're playing in my living room, with Ethan making silly faces at you." From the corner of her eye, Grace spotted Ethan helping a new student, Tommy, straighten his bow tie. Her heart swelled as she watched her son, because that's truly what he was now, being so kind to others. "Tommy, come meet my mom," Ethan called out, waving Grace over. "She's the best piano teacher ever." Grace walked over, extending her hand to Tommy. "Welcome to our little music family." "Your mom is really nice," Tommy said to Ethan. "My dad says she's helping lots of kids learn music who couldn't afford lessons before." Ethan beamed with pride. "Yeah, she makes everything better. Even Dad smiles all the time now." In the audience, Daniel sat in the front row, his work clothes exchanged for a clean button-down shirt. Mrs. Henderson, their next-door neighbor, leaned over to whisper, "What a difference a year makes, doesn't it?" Daniel nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He remembered that desperate morning in the diner, asking a kind waitress to play pretend. Now, watching Grace organize the children with gentle authority, he could hardly believe the blessing that had grown from that deception. The lights dimmed, and Grace stepped onto the stage. Her voice carried clearly through the room. "Welcome, everyone, to our first family music night. These children have worked so hard, and they're excited to share their music with you." One by one, students performed their pieces. Some played perfectly, others stumbled but recovered with encouraging smiles from Grace. Each child received warm applause, their families beaming with pride. Ethan's turn came halfway through the program. He and Grace sat together at the piano, their fingers dancing across the keys in a simple duet. Daniel's eyes grew misty, remembering how his son used to sit alone in his room, drawing pictures of an incomplete family. Tommy's mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "It's wonderful to see Ethan so happy now. He used to be so quiet in class last year." Between performances, Grace shared stories about each student's progress. Her face glowed with joy, and Daniel couldn't take his eyes off her. This was the woman who had brought music back into their lives, not just through the piano, but through laughter at breakfast, singing while doing dishes, and humming lullabies at bedtime. The final piece featured all the students singing together, with Grace accompanying on piano. Their young voices filled the room with, "What a wonderful world," and parents reached for each other's hands, touched by the simple beauty of the moment. After the applause died down and families began to gather their things, Ethan bounced between different groups, introducing Grace to anyone who would listen. "This is my mom," he'd say, the words flowing naturally now, without hesitation or doubt. Mrs. Peterson, the school principal who had once received Ethan's "My New Mommy" essay, approached Grace with tears in her eyes. "You've done so much for this community, dear, not just the music lessons, but showing us all what healing looks like." As they helped stack chairs and clean up programs, Daniel watched Grace hug each of her students goodbye. She had found her purpose here, turning her past pain into a gift for others. The community center, once struggling to stay open, now hummed with life several days a week as children came for lessons. The night air was crisp as they finally stepped outside. Stars twinkled overhead, and a gentle breeze carried the last hints of summer. Ethan skipped ahead, then came back to walk between them. Without hesitation, he slipped his small hand into Grace's, then reached for Daniel's. The three of them walked slowly, savoring the moment. Other families called out goodnight as they passed, car doors shutting softly in the distance. Grace looked up at the stars, then at the two people beside her. Her voice was soft but sure as she whispered, "This feels like home." Daniel squeezed his son's hand and met Grace's eyes in the starlight. "It is. What would you do if you were in their place?" Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel Cooper, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.